Hello and welcome back to the world of Spirit and Shield. Again, my name is John and I will continue to be your guide throughout this journey. Spirit and Shield is a brand new fantasy world that we are exploring through short stories. Today, we have our third short story. It's called First Dance. And we're going to explore a new part of the world today, the land of the Kamashai. It should be a very interesting culture. I'm very excited to explore it. Still a lot of unknowns with the Kamashai, so I'm very much looking forward to kind of learning about them with you guys. So as always, if you have any questions or comments, please post them down below. If you would like to explore like a certain aspect of the story or of the culture or anything that happens to come up, please post that down below too, and we'll take a look at it, maybe in another story or maybe in some additional content. Alright, so again, this is First Dance. She spun quickly. Her saber sliced through the air. She rose and fell, the blade flashing around her. Every twist, every movement was precise and smooth and powerful. Her arm lashed out to her right and swept around her in a complete, unbroken circle. Though she had practiced each movement individually, they were now indistinguishable from each other. Every part of her, including the saber, for a saber was merely an extension of the body for the Kamashai. Every movement was in rhythm with the rattling drums that filled the clearing in the sparse forest. Back and forth, a leap, a twist, a roll of the shoulders and a flick of the wrist. Mishwa watched her intently, and she felt it. The drums, the dance, the saber, the lapis lazuli gleaming in her leather wristbands. The energy. She felt it building and filling the air like pressure before a storm, until finally it burst. A bitter cold wind rose and swirled around the dancer, though it was yet summer. Faster and faster they danced together, woman and wind. Fine shimmering crystals began to form around them. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The drum's final beat echoed as the wind died down, and the woman stood in her final pose. Mishwa gasped. The crystals fell and settled on the woman, on her dress, in her hair, on her skin. The dancer walked around gracefully, showing the audience the effect of the spell. One by one, they stood up. Then, in unison, they bowed deeply to the dancer to show their gratitude. She bowed in return, then went into the crowd where her infant son was waiting for her milk. The boy had been born just the week before, and though it was not the reason the dancer was chosen for this performance, it certainly made it more spectacular. Mishwa watched as the dancer, Najira, fed her son, and bit by bit, he began to shimmer as well. She's so beautiful and graceful. Najira is the most talented dancer ever. Mishwa referred to her as Najirasa, only to herself. She would never dare to use such a familiar form with someone whom she felt was so far above herself. Still, in her mind, they were the best of friends, sisters even. Mishwa had always wanted an older sister. Instead, she was plagued with 4 brothers who were constantly dirty, smelly, and always fighting, and who would tease her about her many dreams, one of which was to become a great spell dancer herself. Although spell dancing was a common vocation for a young Kamashai girl to take up, Mishwa had so far had some difficulties in her training. As eager as she was to learn and perform every movement perfectly and with the proper spirit, the eagerness in her head and heart got confused in the transmission to her limbs, which would flail about awkwardly, or at times miss the instructions altogether, and Mishwa would be left standing there like stone. Some of the other students, mostly girls, would laugh at her, especially Najira. This was not the same Najira as the one who had just danced so purely. In Mishwa's eyes, she could do no wrong. This other Najira was in her 8th or maybe 9th year, like Mishwa, and at times could be so cruel that it made Mishwa consider giving up spell dancing altogether. So shaken was her confidence. Mishwa always wondered how it was possible that 2 people so very different could share the same name. Indeed, she so disliked this unfortunate coincidence that she had, in her mind of course, taken to calling the lesser Najira Truhalaja, or pig face, though Truhalaja did not resemble a pig at all. On the contrary, she was indeed a very beautiful girl, with bright eyes, a slender, graceful figure, and a pleasant smile. All of these made Mishwa despise her even more. Mishwa glared at her nemesis, who stood in line 3 students ahead of her. A soft tap on her back, accompanied by an even softer voice in her ear, shook her from her musings. "Nigirala was so wonderful, wasn't she?" whispered a timid, short girl with rounded features and an exceptionally large forehead that caused Mishwa to begin referring to her as Moonface, again in her own mind only. This was Taja, Mishwa's best friend in the whole world, although admittedly she had not met anyone in the world outside of her own tribe. "Oh yeah, she was absolutely sublime," Mishwa answered with delight. She'd recently heard her mother use the word and decided to try its effect on her friend. To Mishwa's disappointment, Taja hardly seemed to notice at all. After a moment, Taja spoke again. "Are you nervous?" "Of course not," Mishwa lied, her ears beginning to crimson. Taja shifted her feet a little. "I am," she said softly. "Oh, but you mustn't be," Mishwa said, taking her friend by the arm. "You're such a wonderful dancer, and you'll be sublime too." After this second attempt again produced no significant results, Mishwa gave up on the new word, deciding that she must have heard it incorrectly, or that maybe it was something only her mother said. "What if I forget a movement, or I trip and fall?" Taja continued. "You won't," Mishwa reassured her. "You never forgot any moves in the whole training, and I've only ever seen you fall once, and that was just because Jarrett tripped you." "But that was training. I've never done it for real." "None of us have," Mishwa said, then thoughtfully added with a scowl, "Jarrett's a nettle." Taja looked down. "I think he's nice," she almost whispered. Just then the first student, a thin girl with large bony knees, began her dance. The drums beat out a simple rhythm as the girl moved across the clearing. Mishwa watched her anxiously. With every movement, Mishwa thought the girl's knees would knock together and trip her up. It was, of course, a different and much simpler dance than the one performed earlier by Najira. Despite her knees, the young dancer moved remarkably well, hitting each movement in perfect time and flowing gently into the next. About halfway through the dance, the girl stopped suddenly. She stared at her hands in astonishment. They were glowing with a soft white light. She was so shocked that she almost didn't hear the trainer and her parents urging her to continue dancing. Mishwa and the other students stared in wonder and began to chatter excitedly. For an instructor to dance a spell was one thing, but they'd never seen a student do it. Immediately, Mishwa felt a wave of confidence come over her. The dancer with knobby knees finally regained her senses and, with a huge smile and reddening face, continued her dance to the end. The students all cheered her and patted her on the back. The pause in the middle of the dance resulted in an incomplete spell. At the end, only the tips of her fingers were left glowing, but she did not care one bit. She ran over to her parents, who were sitting on the ground with the rest of the audience. They pulled her close and hugged her. She then joined them to watch the rest of the students dance. One by one, the young dancers got up and danced their first spell, with varying degrees of success. One student was so nervous about the whole affair that she vomited in the middle of the spell. Her classmates erupted in laughter, disgust, and horror, while the poor girl was taken off to the side and given some water. She had actually been doing very well, and the spell was beginning to work. As a result, her vomit had a soft glow to it. Mishwa dramatically buried her head in her friend's chest to avoid the sight. The boys, including Jarrett the Nettle, got closer and tried to investigate by poking it with sticks until the instructors and parents intervened, and the mess was cleaned up and order was restored. The next student danced awkwardly, as if he were made of wood. He didn't glow, even a little bit. The two girls who followed him also failed to produce any significant effect. Mishwa began to worry. Would she glow? She had just assumed they all would. They all trained together. They were all doing the same spell, the same dance. All wore the same dance gowns and shoes, except the boys, of course, who wore dance coats. All wore the same wristbands with the same pale gems. Each student was just about the same age, though the boys were a year or two older. The students who didn't glow were actually really not much different from the others, and not much different from Mishwa. Her heart began to falter at this realization. Her nerves grew shaky and her hands grew sweaty. She looked around at her classmates. Did they feel the same? Could they see her heart pounding? Could they see her stomach trying to jump into her throat? Mishwa glanced quickly at her Taja. Her moon face remained pale and serene as always. If any of them felt the same, they surely didn't show it. Mishwa was alone with her insecurities. Just then, Jarrett stood up to begin his dance. Nettle, Mishwa mumbled. Taja paid no attention to the comment. Jarrett's status as a nettle was one of the very few things they didn't see eye to eye on. As Jarrett leapt and danced around the clearing, Mishwa watched intently. At first, she was just curious if nettles could glow, but then she watched in amazement as Jarrett began to glow wonderfully from head to toe. He does dance well, Mishwa thought to herself. For a nettle. On the topic of nettles, Mishwa began to wonder if her nemesis, Najira, would glow. Even though she was just a few students from the front of the line, Najira did not seem to be nervous at all. She was casually talking with one of her friends and playing with her braid. Mishwa was infuriated. How could she be so calm, while Mishwa was certain she would collapse from her nerves before she even got to the front of the line? It wasn't right. It wasn't fair. Jarrett glowing was one thing, but Mishwa would not be able to stand it if Najira glowed. She already knew that Najira would dance perfectly. She could see it already. She would dance with so much precision and so much grace that she would just glow instantly like the sun, and she would do everything right and wouldn't trip or freeze or frog dance, a term Najira herself created to describe Mishwa's dancing. No, she would be perfect, and everyone, including Najira-sa, would cheer her and hug her, and Mishwa couldn't bear it. She opened her eyes and looked up. Najira was beginning her dance. She greeted the audience with a radiant smile. She closed her hands briefly as the drums began. Slowly and gracefully, she opened up like a flower, her body flowing from one movement into the next. Mishwa looked around, pretending to be bored by the spectacular performance, but at the same time keeping watch through the corner of her eye. It was while she was pretending to be interested in a chimaeran scurrying around in a tree that it happened. At first, Mishwa could barely see it, but a sudden gasp from the audience told her something was wrong. She looked over quickly. Najira was on the ground. She had fallen. Mishwa's eyes widened. She no longer pretended not to be interested in what was happening. Najira sat up slowly. She had her back turned to Mishwa, but Mishwa could see her shoulders heaving up and down. One of the trainers ran over to her, but as soon as she reached her, Najira jumped up and ran into the forest, tears streaming down her face, and braid dancing mockingly behind her back. Mishwa stood there staring. Then she began to feel something she didn't expect. The friends that Najira had been standing with in line didn't move. Why aren't they going? Mishwa thought, anger welling up inside her. They should go to her. Finally, she just couldn't take it any longer. Mishwa ran off into the woods in pursuit of her nemesis. It wasn't hard to find Najira. All Mishwa had to do was follow the broken sobs left hanging in the branches, and there she was, sitting at the base of a large tree, her face buried in her hands, her ears crimson to the tips. Mishwa stopped when she saw her, and slowly approached, as if she were a wild animal wounded in the hunt. Najira raised her head slightly to wipe her eyes, and she saw Mishwa. She stared at her. Mishwa stared back. Najira's cheeks were red and splotchy, her runny nose barely held back by sniffles, and her eyes were watery. She made quite a pitiful sight. But Mishwa felt no pity for her nemesis, but empathy, for Mishwa was seeing her own deepest fears play out in this other girl. None of the words Mishwa knew could express what she now felt, and sublime certainly was not appropriate. So Mishwa walked over, knelt down, and hugged Najira. Najira hesitated at first, then hugged her back, and the two sat silently together, sharing their failures and their fears. A few moments later, Taja came running through the woods. Recovering quickly and with great tact from the shocking scene before her, she said, "Mishwuna, it's your turn to dance." Najira looked at Mishwa, smiled, and nodded, and the three ran back to the clearing. They reached it much faster than Mishwa had expected, and before she knew it, she was ushered into the middle of the circle of people, and the drums began with a steady rhythm. With Najira's tears now cold on her cheek, Mishwa began the dance. It wasn't a perfect dance, but she danced with passion, with sadness, and with immense spirit. She soon forgot about the people around her, about the drums, about her fears, about Najira's failure. She thought about nothing. Her spirit flowed through her arms, her legs, her fingers and feet. She began to feel her skin tingle, then cool, tighten and freeze, as if the cold wind from the winter steppe was blowing across it. Then a soft light began to shine through her skin. Pale, cold white at first, it began to glow blue and green and violet as well. Soon all the colors of the winter night sky shone through Mishwa's skin. Her heart felt like it would burst. Her skin tingled now too, not from magic, but from excitement. She spun and swirled, her colors flashing around her. She thought she heard music, not just from the drums, but elsewhere as well. After what seemed like a lifetime spent in a dream, Mishwa slowed and finished the dance with one final, frog-like, yet graceful movement. Mishwa looked around for the first time since she had started the dance. Everyone was staring in wonder at her. Her parents and even her brothers were smiling. Najira was smiling too. Mishwa thought she could even see her infant son smiling as well. Mishwa scanned the crowd and found Najira, the pig face, the Truhalaja, her nemesis, sitting with her family in the crowd. Her eyes were dry now, but they still shone, and her beautiful smile reached from ear to ear as she shared in her friend's joy. Estoran fen. So that is the end of First Dance, the short story about Mishwa, the young Kamashai girl, and her first experience with spell dancing. As it is likely your first experience with spell dancing as well, I would love to hear your comments and your thoughts on it. So feel free to go ahead and post them down below. Any questions as well? There will be some additional content coming out soon related to spell dancing, related to the Kamashai in general. Some of that will be for patrons only. It will all be up on my Patreon page, so I'll post a link to that down below. But yeah, again, to my patrons, thank you very much for supporting me and for supporting this project. And any future patrons, again, thank you in advance. It really means the world to me. So I guess that's all for this week. Check back next week where I'll be posting another video. It won't be a story this time, but it will be like commentary and answers to questions, and maybe exploring some of the finer points of this story in a little bit more depth. So again, that video will be posted next week, and yeah, looking forward to it. So again, thank you guys for joining me on this journey, and we'll continue in a little bit. So until then, take care.